Today, in our lecture on communication and technology, we close the history of technologies that we will look at with finally arriving at the present. Social media and mobile are the most recent additions to this long history. And with that, we will transition into the future. So, social media and mobile are closely connected. And just over the last days, many media outlets would have pieces discussing the role of, in particular, Twitter, but also other tools in organizing protests, namely the Black Lives Matter protests that take place in many places in the United States and all over the world. So Twitter in particular has quite some history of being named as causing uprisings, even organizing activism and acting as a tool to articulate and spread political opinions for the better or the worse. Social media in the last years have continuously played undoubtedly an important role in political organizations, thinking of, for example, the ongoing protests in Hong Kong and other places that we know of, particularly of the spreading of information and images that people take during the protests. The image as a means of showing the world what is going on is closely tied to social media platforms that make it easily possible to share. 10 years ago, the first political uprising took place that was explicitly tied to this technological development. The so-called Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia and then spread over other countries, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and to some extent, basically all over the Middle East and North Africa, was a powerful uprising of people that some of you might maybe remember. I mean, the West, of course, never short of seeing their own importance, would immediately say, well, that's great. We brought these democratizing tools to people, and now they can organize and find their way to democracy thanks to our technology. It unfortunately was absolutely not that simple. So while there is some kind of momentum that could be gained in the Arab Spring and other political movements by the use of social media, it is absolutely not at all clear if the technology was the cause or the technology is just a vessel in which people's already ongoing political impetus would find its way. So here we have a par excellence example of the question of technological determinism or social constructions. So the question is, were people, for example, in Egypt, in the first place, so dissatisfied with the regime of Hosni Mubarak, the ruler that had been in charge basically forever and had impoverished and made people's lives increasingly difficult, while in other places of the world, I mean, media would show that things would progress towards more wealth and well-being for people, and also in particular for more freedom in expression and carrying out people's religions. So Egypt was particularly interesting. The protests that formed were clearly organized over social media. I think no one doubts that. And were able to finally overthrow the government. So Mubarak had to resign and was imprisoned. And shortly after that, free elections took place. What happened was that the government that was elected under the following president, Al-Mursi, was strongly leaning towards the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood has not really a reputation of being a democratic driver. And many people were very disappointed of this turning out. But I mean, this is how democracy works. In a democracy, you can't choose who gets elected, you know. And of course, in the following, and you might have some remembrance of that. I mean, if you ask yourself why Qatar is in such disgrace these days in the UAE, it has particularly to do with Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab Spring. I mean, this Muslim Brotherhood government that would make such good use of social media and the internet was, of course, a threat to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, and other governments that would not so much favor, of course, a revolutionary movement, but more tend to, I mean, if at all, kind of evolutionary change, gradually allowing more and more freedoms rather than from one day to the next hit the switch. And so the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt didn't last long. It was overthrown again by a military coup, and now we have again a government. I mean, in the style of Mubarak's government. So we are kind of back to zero, back to start, as if the Arab Spring never had happened. The same is true in many other countries. Some countries are, of course, even worse off. If you think of Libya ousting and killing the long-year dictator Gaddafi, and having no proper government after that, being shaken by civil war. The same, of course, is true in Syria and other countries. So the question, if social media is such a great tool for activism, is rightfully to be asked now. And the self-celebrating West should really reconsider what they did in introducing a technology that would make it easy for people seamlessly to gather and to take political action without making it clearly much easier to find a political goal that's worthwhile fighting for it. I mean, it's one thing overthrowing a government, the other is finding a new government that actually would be able to have a consensus in society. And even worse, of course, I mean, in its attempt to help people being not surveyed, WhatsApp, for example, by the request of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, introduced peer-to-peer encryption. So you can be pretty safe on WhatsApp communicating with each other. In most parts of the world, the government will not know what you tell. And so WhatsApp is a great tool. Everyone uses it. It is incredibly widespread. It is totally inconspicuous. If you use it, no one will suspect you of spreading messages for political unrest. However, in this sealing it off for surveillance, of course, a second thing happens as well. No one can moderate it. There is no chance in helping if there is a mob forming for whatever deranged political goals, for example, xenophobic and right-wing goals, as we have seen many times, as this news item, for example, tells the story of people turning against each other in India by accusing alleged crimes of child molestation to people who, as it turned out, had nothing to do at all, and the whole thing was made up in the first place. No child was ever abducted in that case. And of course, social media has a long history of being a platform not only to democratic, but also to the very opposite of democratic forces. In particular, in these bulletin boards, they were the first social media in the beginning of the internet. Like long before the web, there were these bulletin board services where you could undisturbed spread your misinformation. Now we have Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, whatever it is called, it had to change its name, all these totally toxic junkyards of anti-democratic and hateful people gathering, spreading their lies, and using these tools for their political rallies. I doubt that the people reading these things actually believe what's said there. It is more that these narratives, like ancient myth, like fairy tales, are a common narrative that people can relate to. They are like metaphors that people find in a symbolic way uniting against their enemy, which is just the other. So there is both sides to it. There is clearly democratic protests. There is also the march to the institution by anti-democratic forces using social media for their purposes. You may have read also the governments, even like, for example, Russia or Iran, having whole armies of social media activists militarizing social media for their political purposes, influencing elections, changing people's minds, and using social media platforms for their manipulations. So I think it's an interesting topic to look deeper into. One of the most political media platforms, I think, that ever existed. And the interesting thing is, why does it exist in the first place? And why is it so strong? Why do we have these companies now with global power in social media? One thing that has changed is all kinds of growth factors regarding communication technology. So if you look at this chart, it shows you that over the last 50, 60 years, the number of satellites sent to space was pretty stable in the ballpark between 1,000 and 1,500, depending which decade. However, this has changed in the last 10 years. It has more than doubled and will certainly even more be growing over the next 10 years. Why is it now worthwhile to send so many objects into space? Well, the answer is it has become much cheaper. Space technology is really a boom industry. And the reason it has become so cheap is that so many communication satellites and satellites that are related to mobile technology, like navigation satellites for the global positioning systems and relay satellites that would connect data from one place to the next, have become a major driver for space travel. So it is low orbiting satellites that are shot up, as well as geostationary satellites in the thousands, really. Behind that, of course, is this curve. So the thing that you see immediately is that until very recently, the population on the Earth and how many human beings lived was pretty stable. I mean, if you look even 100 years ago, the curve is still pretty low compared to the almost 8 billion people that we have now living on the Earth. And the fascinating thing is that you might think all kinds of trouble comes from it. And of course, we know that there is, for example, climate change happening. But other factors are changing as well. For example, more people can read and write than ever before. So literacy is something that we can almost take for granted now. So we have not only 8 billion people, but 8 billion people who are at least basically educated. And if you have people who can read and write, you can, of course, use communication technology that requires literacy. So we have now platforms that can address not only the small scale national market of the traditional 19th century nation states that might have been some 10 million or maybe even 100 million people, but very limited in terms of the growth. Even the television market of the West, or the traditional technology markets of the Cold War era, that might have been maybe 200, 300 million people. This is also the market of the PC, of the pre-mobile computer. Now, when we see 8 billion people, most of them being literate, we can aim for all of them as the market for mobile devices. And this is exactly what had happened. So we have almost 3/4 of the population in the world being connected, and 2/3 of the world's population being connected to the internet. There's, of course, a difference. I mean, if you are able to send only text messages versus being able to access web pages or use social media that require an internet connection. So within a very short time, I mean, really incredibly short, mobile technology and internet broadband technology has spread all over the world and opens up a business opportunity as well as a political platform with billions of people to address. The connectivity that people can theoretically achieve is even not that bad. If you think of a global connectivity of almost 2/3 in 4G, which means that you can have video calls or basically look at any web content, and the very fast rise of the 5G technology that would then, in the long run, make any kind of streaming services and virtual reality available. Of course, the wealth in communication is not evenly distributed. There is significant differences between as the Pew Research here calls, advanced economies and emerging economies. In particular, there is, I would say, a cultural difference that's very interesting to look at. There is cultures where people make much more use of the traditional functionality of phones. I would say the UAE is a good example. I mean, here, everyone has to have a phone. I mean, everything is tied to your phone number, and you get calls all the time. And I mean, coming from a country where no one would ever call, I mean, that is really something that I found really difficult to adjust to, that no one would send you an email, but everyone would always call. I find that, of course, totally annoying, but obviously this is how people here want to have their things. So I would say that it's not a technological question. I mean, of course, the UAE is one of the most advanced economies in terms of the spread of mobile broadband, great coverage in every corner of the country, and clearly everyone has a smartphone here. However, it is not the culture. And so it is important to see the driver of technology here, not only the availability of broadband and that you can actually afford a phone, but also that there's cultural differences if people use traditional text messages and voice calls versus apps and internet related services. So, as you know, there is only two operating systems, two platforms basically, that play any role in mobile, which is Android and iOS. So it is Android, which of course is not Google. Android is an open source platform that is, however, very closely connected to two drivers, which one is Google, that run all their Google services, particularly for Android. And the other, of course, is China. So in China, several of the large mobile service providers, of the large phone companies, issue their own flavors of Android that works without Google. So these two main drivers, I mean, companies like Xiaomi, I hope I pronounced that not totally ridiculously, the newcomer in Chinese mobile technology, or Huawei, the market leader in Chinese mobile technology, in particular, also, of course, in broadcast technology for mobile services. These two companies are major drivers in the Android world. And on the Apple side, we have only Apple, which is also remarkable that you have one company being so dominant in a market. But as I mentioned, the economies of scale are enormous. If you have billions of people, you can address a billion customers at one time, and have the advantage of the scale. Marginal costs can go down really to a microscopic level. And the entry barrier for any newcomer is astronomical. So we will see these monopolies, I think, stay for a while. It doesn't mean that they will stay forever. So you might remember the mentioning of the hype cycle and the S-curve in the discussion on techno-determinism and progress. And here we have it. I mean, clearly we have S-curves in growth. I mean, when 80% or so of a country have already mobile broadband and a smartphone, I mean, the last 20% is always the most difficult. It's always difficult in the beginning. I mean, to start off a technology, and then comes the time of exponential growth when everyone wants the new technology, and then comes, of course, the last percentage that doesn't want it or can't afford it. That is the hardest to get. And you see that the mobile technology has a long time ago already passed what was ever there in terms of the classical computer technologies. In fact, that is 20 years now that mobile technology plays a major role and has surpassed anything in digital. So let's have a look at the companies that are behind the social media and mobile revolution. So the largest companies in the world in this visualization, you see 20 years ago, that is at the peak of the so-called dot-com bubble. I mean, what happens in the so-called dot-com bubble was a decade of internet and digital media growth over the 90s, combined with a general attitude of globalization. It's the years where in many countries, like in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in many countries that had a lot of economic power, people, the governments were in charge, were leaning towards reduction of tariffs, of organizing global trade agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and the World Trade Organization was formed during that time. Globalization was on people's minds, and the perspective of companies that had already a global footprint for the stock market was rather promising. And by the end of the decade, a run on stocks started that was unprecedented. So many companies' values was completely inflated, and many companies that were traded, turned out to be rather scammy and not worth the money. So a year later, the end of the year 2000, the deflation started and the bubble burst. Many companies went away, some survived. As you see here, for example, Microsoft is still around. No one talks much about them, but they are still among the most valuable companies, as we shall see. Microsoft was the first company to, I mean, it's debated accidentally or consciously, see the potential of a more than national market for digital technology, while the rest of the pack would either address hobbyists with do-it-yourself computer toys, like, for example, the Commodore 64, which was the first computer I used. You couldn't do much with it. I mean, you can play simple games with it. You can learn simple programming languages with it. So, I mean, as a toy, it is rather powerful, but it is not really something you would run a business on. And on the other hand, you would have IBM totally targeting a business world with very expensive computers that you would usually buy together with a package of service and maintenance. And Microsoft, between 1990, when Windows came out, and 1999, when they finally had won the so-called browser war and became the most dominant company to display internet content, Microsoft did very well in seeing that the computer was in between, that with the personal computer, you could have both. You could have professional services running on it as well as people using it in their homes. So the desktop publishing revolution took place in the 90s. That means that people would have a computer from which they would do anything that you would usually do in an agency, running all steps of publishing, like doing the layout, doing the editing, and also the printing, because it's the time when the laser printer became a thing, so people could actually print at high quality what they would usually had to give to a printing shop. And then from 1993 on came the internet, and the internet was seen as the major driver for all kinds of companies. And that you see also with Cisco. So Cisco is an interesting in between. So Cisco I mean, the name is of course a play on the word San Francisco. This is where the company is sitting, and you see the Golden Gate Bridge in the logo. Cisco is a player in Silicon Valley to this day. And before Huawei became so dominant, Cisco was really one of the companies who developed and supplied all the gear that the telecommunication companies needed to vamp up their lines in the ground and through the air to distribute the internet protocol. So Cisco is the company that is kind of synonymous for the internet router, the box through which the internet traffic is routed, hence the word. If you look into the technology of the internet protocol, TCP/IP, that requires routers, it is not just switches as in a traditional telephone net where you switch a line and the line stays. It is you have all these packets running through the net, and wherever there is a free path, they get routed through. And Cisco is the company that understood that and had an enormous growth and became one of the most valuable companies in the world. Nokia, some of you might remember Nokia, was a quite successful mobile phone company. In fact, Nokia was still the most successful company selling smartphones 2 years after the iPhone was introduced. So in 2008, Nokia was still the world market leader in phones. That shows you that it was not just Apple coming into the market with the iPhone that brought Nokia. Nokia still grew. It was other drivers, like, for example, Apple's invention of the App Store and incentivizing developers to come up with app ideas. Hence, creating the app ecosystem and getting such a big supporter base of developers, of hundreds of thousands of software developers jumping on the train to develop apps instead of traditional web applications that would be mobile optimized then. Yeah, and this is also my own story, because in 2012 I decided that it was time to leave my employed position as a researcher in an advertising agency and start my own company together with partners that would focus on doing media research using mobile apps. And that is what I did between 2012 and 2018, when I sold my shares and left the company. So we built mobile apps, doing all kinds of market research, quantified self, and explored the possibilities of mobile data. Yeah, I mean, and then let's have a look at the remaining companies. There is, of course, Walmart, the retailer, is still very strong. It's about the same size as Amazon these days. Intel and NTT are strong in the field of providing tools. Intel is the semiconductor company. NTT is the Japanese telephone company that is also running big laboratories. Yeah, and Exxon and British Petroleum at the time still among the most valuable companies in the world. Saudi Aramco, of course, is not listed here. It would have been leading the crowd with a large margin. As you might remember, Saudi Aramco just went public a few months ago. So this is there is no valuation, no market capitalization that would be comparable to the other companies. Yeah, let's move forward 20 years. This is how the world looks now. So we have three companies, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon, that each are valued about $1 trillion. So $1 trillion is surpassing most of the world economies in terms of value. So these companies are valued more than many of these world's countries' economies would be in their entirety. So Microsoft is still there, which is really surprising. I mean, that they could turn around their downswing and find the confidence in shareholders still investing into their technology. I mean, for people who are brought up with the internet and mobile technology, it seems really mysterious that anyone would believe that Microsoft could survive any longer. But I mean, obviously, people see great value in their tools still. Apple is an interesting company in that they see themselves or position themselves as a hardware company, providing services to increase the stickiness, the retention, people staying with the devices that Apple sells by means of offering added value, like, for example, the iCloud or the app the app ecosystem around the App Store. So Apple is really an interesting one, having such a large share in operation systems, and being always kind of market defining, even if other companies usually are first what the technology is that they introduce. Apple is usually better in scaling it up. And Amazon, as this the new retail giant, about the same size as Walmart in terms of their revenues, however, valued much higher than Walmart these days. Amazon, that is what people tend to overlook, is much more, of course, than a retailer. Their major revenue driver is not retail, or at least was not until very recently. It was Amazon Web Services. So, about, I think, a third to half of the world's website and web content runs over Amazon servers. By that, of course, they have major economies of scale. Amazon data centers have about 85% of the world's data center market. So this is really a head start that is not easy for other companies to ever catch up. And Google, with their subsidies, for a brief time was called the Alphabet. Now they turned it back and said, well, Alphabet was not that much of a great idea in the first place, because we only have Google. Search engine business is the world's leading advertiser platform. The revenues of Google, the advertising revenues of Google in most countries in the world are larger than that of any other media category, like, for example, television or print advertising. Facebook, clearly the leading communication platform, Um, then comes Berkshire Hathaway. It's an investment company. They're interesting in one aspect because they clearly survived and came out very strong the other side. The two crises, the dot-com crisis of 2000 and the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Yeah, these are the so-called stacks, BAT-FANG, as they are called. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, the three giants of Chinese digital media, and then Facebook, Amazon, Apple, depending on your leaning, Microsoft or Netflix and Google, BAT-FANG. These companies are seen as the major drivers of digital media and behind everything that we would think of interactive media on the business side of things these days, the stacks. Well, so let's look at how it began with social media. Social media is, as you might imagine, very closely tied to mobile technology, using apps like Instagram or Snapchat to use the camera of your phone, the social media functionality to post and comment on other people's posts, location-based services to tie what you have to share with where you are. And of course, carrying that around with you, having it at hands all the time, is of course what makes social media actually social. However, we should not forget that social media began a different way and that there is powerful social media platforms that people tend to overlook. Well, Wikipedia, for example, clearly is social media. Wikipedia is created by people in a peer-to-peer way. And I mean, to see the dynamics of social media, you just look at the lemmata. Lemma is an article, is a topic that is it's summarized under one headline. It's called lemma in Greek, and hence is a lemma in a lexicon, in an encyclopedia. So if you look at lemmata like Nicolaus Copernicus, that have a very, I would say, vivid history of edits, it's always interesting to look at the discussions that that the editing accompanies. This is clearly a topic that will be covered much more in depth in the Politics of Code seminar, usually. But let's just, for the sake of understanding the social of social media, look at the discussion side of this lemma. If you look at the Wikipedia entries in the web view, not in the mobile view, you can always see how the articles are edited by clicking on View History. And then you can go back in time and look what people contributed or deleted. And also, if you click on the talk button next to the article button, you come to the talk page. And here you see immediately that a lot is going on. In particular, if you look down to the right-hand side here, you see that there is a lot of discussion about nationality, which is curious because, I mean, Copernicus lived in a time when the concept of nation was not yet invented. But nevertheless, I mean, the nationality of Copernicus seemed to be of some contestation, and people find it really important to discuss if Copernicus would be Polish, or if he would be German, or if he would be of whatever other ethnicity, or if the nationality of Copernicus should be left out in the first place. Of course, I don't want to take any stand here. I find it totally ridiculous. At the time when nation was not conceived yet, and Copernicus would live in a region of Poland that indeed went back and forth between various powers over time, many times. And Germany as a country as a nation was not even invented at that point. I mean, Germany was first formed in 1871, which means 500 years after Copernicus lived. So it's totally ridiculous, I think, to have a discussion like that. But it shows you what is on people's minds. And it shows you that it is created in a social way. And if there is no moderation, then people's views clash without any cushioning. So there is no crumple zone that prevents people from directly throwing into each other's faces all their prejudice and all their hypocrisy, all their self-righteousness, and all their difficulties with themselves and with their society in which they live. So Wikipedia can be a very violent place. If you go to the discussions about which articles should be deleted, that gets even more emotional, because I mean, nothing is worse than you put work into something and then it gets deleted. Also, you find in Wikipedia all the sexism and racism that we complain about in the digital domain in the first place. So between 95 and 99% of all contributions in Wikipedia are written by men. Only between 1 and 5% are written by women, and it's declining. Why is that the case? It is, of course, that didn't went unnoticed. Many people discuss that there is research going on. It seems that Wikipedia, the communication culture of Wikipedia editing is particularly male. And the key people communicating in these discussions are not at all willing to use any kind of more cultivated form of expression. So it is, as in many fields in the digital world, that this particular masculine and right-leaning way of speaking, of pushing away minority opinions, in pushing always for a majority that rules, is there very present. Yeah, this is, of course, a problem in all social media. Social media seem, I mean, always support who cries the loudest, who is the most active. And so this kind of male-dominated, white supremacist world of activism, of gaining merits by just being there and doing more than the others, instead of contributing meaningfully, maybe, or having a positive influence, creating an inclusive and welcoming culture, that doesn't seem to play much role. And that is one of the major problems of all social media platforms. I mean, a lot has been said of that. This is just one of many articles that summarizes everything that's wrong with social media, and it, I mean, goes into the topic right away here. I mean, social media are bad for you because they use algorithms to target you based on the data they collect about you. This is certainly not true for Wikipedia, but it's true for all other platforms like Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. As you know, these platforms don't show you the content you want, they show you the content they want you to see. They tell you that it might be some kind of ranking of relevance, but it has a lot to do with making the platform more sticky. And this leads to the second point here, the creation of the filter bubble. The word filter bubble, I think, came up about 8 years ago. So, I mean, it was during the Arab Spring, basically. It's this kind of chamber of resonance. It is only being exposed to your own opinion. So you see people, I mean, you select basically people you follow as the people to whom you listen, and that is just repeating the opinion that you already have. And the algorithms that the social media companies use to see what you might find relevant or worth reading or worth watching, enforce that even further. So then social media is bad for you because they are profit centered. I mean, I don't know what's wrong about that. I mean, of course, I mean, as a left-leaning person, I might say, well, creating profit is not a good thing in as such. But if you look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia is not really profit-centered, and it has all the negative qualities of social media as well. So being profit-centered, I would say, might sometimes be annoying. I mean, because the social media companies are not public, so there is no public there. So you can't, for example, force them to do what a public broadcaster so might be forced to do. There is no oversight, no parliament, for example, or government organization looking into how they behave. They are basically responsible to their shareholders and not to their users. So there has a lot of negative arguments being profit oriented. But as you see at the example of Wikipedia and other non-profit social media platforms as well, the profit orientation only makes things worse, but they are not the cause of the problem. Well, then, this addictiveness, I mean, that you can't let go. This is a problem not only of social media, this is a problem of mobile technology with the notification in particular. So there is two urges. The one is that you miss out that something is happening and you don't see it. I mean, there is media that are, I would say, taking a different stance to that, thinking of Snapchat, where things just move away. And that was how social media started. Twitter, for example, and things in Twitter just moved out. I mean, if you wouldn't think of it as news, you would just tune in as a radio station or as a broadcast of television. You'll just switch in and see what's on, and after a while you would tune out, and you wouldn't care that things would still be going on. However, people feel clearly that they are missing out. And so the addictiveness that is pushed into your face with notifications all the time. So someone is saying something. Oh, this is what you missed while you were away. This is what people said in these times. This is, of course, something that is very serious. Um, That is an interesting one. Social media make us feel bad. Clearly, this is the case with bad news. I mean, what we have these days, looking on social media and seeing all the police violence or violence in general, is not made to make us feel great. And the second part here is that they are alienating. That means that we use social media despite being connected to other people at the moment when we use it, we are not connected to the people that we are sitting together with. I'm not so sure about that one, but it's a fair claim. I mean, as a parent, of course, I always feel kind of sad for my children seeing them using social media instead of engaging with conversation. On the other hand, I mean, how often did I engage in conversation with my parents? So I rather would not blame my children for being alienated here. Then we have uh, social media are bad for democracy. I would say this is a rather bold claim. It is techno determinist. I mean, is it really social media that destroyed the democracy? I mean, is it really social media that brought Trump into presidency, or was it rather also the traditional media who would write him literally into presidency by being totally obsessed by, I mean, Trump being a media personality in the first place? So I think that gives social media too much credit. Social media, I think, as mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, of course, play a major role in making it easy for people to take action, making it easy for people to share their thoughts and to find like-minded people. I would say it is rather too much credit to give social media that they are bad for democracy. I think democracy is under pressure always and has been, and the forces against democracy at work make use of social media as they would make use of any other media platform at hand. The addictiveness, I think we had already. The mind control, well, yeah, I wouldn't see too much of that. Um, that, however, is an interesting one. So they get their money from advertising. And indeed, as we shall see in the following minutes, social media and targeted advertising go hands in hands. And the idea of data, um, using data to really understand how people are, that is a major changer that came with. So social media for the first time created data about people's behavior at a scale that would make it possible to use totally different tools for analyzing data. So in traditional advertising technology, that includes everything in digital technology until I would say the year 2005, you would mainly rely on samples. So you would try to get a sample of people that would be somehow representative without going too much into details what that means. And you would survey them and you would try to understand what they did and from that extrapolate on the whole population. With social media, so from 2005 on, there was such an increase on data that was directly related on people's opinions, on people's actions, in particular, when location-based data came with that, for example, with Flickr, this platform where people uploaded their images, that the understanding of people's whereabouts, people's movements, the motive why people would do things by understanding, for example, what they say on platforms like Twitter or Facebook, made it possible to create totally new forms of statistical models of people's behavior. This is exactly what I did for a living. I mean, working in these with the data, overseeing a team of statisticians and data scientists, and moving from traditional market research into data science, into big data. Why is it called big data? Because with social media, for the first time ever, there was more data coming in that could be made sense of with traditional data analysis methods. That starts with Google. So Google is not social media as such, but you might know that Google's algorithm started by analyzing how many links refer to a page, and by that seeing a page as more relevant as a page that would have fewer links pointing towards a website. And Google would start indexing millions and millions and billions of websites, and so much data would come in that Google needed a storage and an operation system platform that would not run out of memory. And by that, in 2005, Hadoop was born. Hadoop became you could say the operation system for big data. It's a system where web data, in particular, JSON formatted data, you will learn what that is in other classes if you don't know it yet. So data that is half formatted, but can basically have any kind of shape. It's much less formatted than tables in a spreadsheet, for example, or in a traditional database, when this data could be stored and accessed. And then people had that suddenly in their data centers. Amazon would provide infinite amount of storage capacity very cheaply. So you could just add more server space if you needed it. And companies like Google would have 500 million or even a trillion or even a billion tweets a day, creating terabytes of information. Facebook would create petabytes of information per day that would flow into these storage units. And then new statistical tools were born, tools that would not take a sample, but use all of the data that was there at one time and make sense of it. And that is in particular machine learning and artificial intelligence. Not everything that comes out of this data, of course, is useful or nice. In particular, you can't rely that this data is by any means equal or just to people. And this is what people had to learn the hard way, really. So Facebook is particularly notorious for always falling into the same pit in not understanding that they might actually do horrible things by targeting people, extrapolating on people's behaviors, just assuming that it would speak for everyone. So why is that important? So there's two things going on. First of all, if you select people by their alleged or assumed leanings, you leave out everyone else. Television advertising doesn't do that. Everyone who tunes into the television and gets the ad break displayed gets the same ads. There is no targeting other than by choosing which time of the day you want your ad to be displayed. So this is all you can do. And everything else is just random. I mean, you are lucky. Many people watch the show in which you place your ad. On the internet, that is totally different. Since there is a one-on-one connection between the server sending the web page to your computer, they can also decide which ad to display to you. And some people might find themselves being excluded from getting offered many things, in particular, financial offers, like, for example, real estate or investment opportunities or job opportunities. So this is a research paper. So people tried out to search for certain terms that are job related, that are related to jobs in the field of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM. And they would clearly prove that if their totally arbitrary chosen profile settings would suggest that they're female, read the paper to understand how they actually did that, Google would just not display them the content. Google would decide that they would rather have girls' content than the real thing. So women might find themselves being excluded from the job market by not even being displayed the job offerings that would be displayed to men all the time. The same is, of course, true of getting offered bank services, financial services, any kind of tools, useful things on Amazon, special offers that would be targeted towards a male audience and whatever. So there is a lot of discrimination going on the side of deciding who gets to see what. And speaking of Google, we can actually look into that. So if you have a Google profile, as all of you do, unfortunately, this university forces you to use Google tools. So you all have a Google profile. You can just enter the ad settings into and look into that. So first of all, Google offers you to not get personalized ads, whatever that means. And then you see all the criteria that Google chose for you to being your profile. I mean, of course, I never told Google that I was married. Google assumes that. So if you look at that, they estimate that by my demographic. I mean, of course, I mean, that is of no business of theirs if I am or if I am not. It is totally assaultive of them to make this assumption without me giving them any kind of consent that they have the right to do that. And you know how dangerous that might be if you find yourself in a society that, for example, would see living in a relationship without being married as being unlawful. So any kind of these assumptions, I mean, Facebook has all kinds of assumptions for for example, sexual preferences as well, gender preferences, and all these things you can target towards. You can buy ads for people who you might think as being in your target group, as, for example, being homosexual. And hardly anyone in the world would ever give these companies their consent. So consent is something that they assume by using. But what alternative do we have? I mean, this university forces us to use Google. We have no choice. And we give Google not our consent. I never did that. And still, Google makes these assumptions. And no matter if I switch that I don't want them to use that to display ads to me, they would still use the data for their models. And I mean, going on with that, I mean, just clicking a bit further here. I mean, these are the jobs that Google chose for me to be relevant. Well, technology industry, I mean, that makes sense. And education sector to some extent, I mean, since I'm teaching, I have no clue what they think I might do in the hospitality sector. I mean, how can they think that that would be of any interest of me? Well, nevertheless, this is what they made up, and every intelligence service and police force in the world can use that against me if they want. So this is the one side of discrimination that we look at. This is the discrimination by making a choice on our behalf, on assuming things about us that we didn't give our consent at all, and then making things in a black box like apparatus to decide what content they think we might want to see or that might be useful for them to display to us. And now let's look at a second form of discrimination that takes place that is much more hidden even and has to do with the data. So this impressive collection of tens of thousands of images was put together by Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford for their exhibition Training Humans in Milan in the Fondazione Prada last year. So Kate Crawford is an activist and researcher, and she has been working in the field of AI ethics for a long time. She's one of the founders of the research institute AI Now that is part of NYU in New York. Trevor Paglen is an artist, and Trevor has worked with digital images for a long time. Satellite images using digital photography to uncover hidden facilities of the military and so on. And recently they have worked together in the field of looking in the role of images in training artificial intelligence and discrimination and racism. So what you see here is thousands of faces of so-called VIPs that Microsoft put together. And these faces have been classified by race and gender and age. So these three categories are put together, and you might imagine that, of course, the people on these images, since it is VIPs, it is people from the media, are by no means representative to how people in the world look at all. First of all, I mean, of course, most of them are white. Most of them are white men, and the women also, I mean, are much more similar, I would say. There's much less diversity in the faces than if you would have just a random sample in the world. So these faces are one of the large databases that are used to train artificial intelligence systems for image recognition. Image recognition means that the system sees this is a face and this is, for example, a car, or this is a traffic signal. So this is image recognition. And then the second is, of course, face recognition, which means this is not just a person, this is a specific person. This is a person that we can identify. So these are the two steps of artificial intelligence in processing images. One of the most notorious, however, still widely used sources to train image recognition is image.net. So ImageNet used the entirety, I think, of the images put up in Flickr. So Flickr was a social media platform that people would upload their images to share them. People who did that never gave any consent that their images would be used to train artificial intelligence. That is a total abuse of people's goodwill in sharing their images with other people, which is why they did that, and just abusing that for the purpose that ImageNet did with it. So ImageNet hired I think about 10,000 people via Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is a service that Amazon offers where you can get cheap labor. I mean, I would call it modern slave labor, really, of people doing click work for you. So this is Amazon Mechanical Turk. These 10,000 people were offered this user interface to classify the images that ImageNet would choose, and they would have to classify that with a second database, which is called WordNet. And WordNet is kind of a lexicon. It's a dictionary of all kinds of attributes to objects. And this is what comes out. So you would see, for example, the former US president as being an amoralist, whatever an amoralist is. Or you would see Jeff Bezos as being an analogist, which I have not the slightest idea what an analogist would be. Then you have this person here as clearly being a hacker. I don't show you the abyss of abuse that you will find in this database. It is no longer publicly available. They removed the access to the database on their website. However, it is still widely used to train systems. I mean, if you look at any kind of attributes that people of color or many women would be pinned down to, I mean, it is a total nightmare. It's all you can imagine of racism, of misogyny, of any kind of discrimination that you may think of. And this is the basis of artificial intelligence. It is the second form of discrimination. So the first, as you remember, is the way, for example, Google or Facebook would decide what content you get displayed. And this one here is what model is trained. So is taking data without caring that the data in itself carries all the prejudice, all that is wrong in society, and by using it to train an artificial intelligence to perpetuate people's prejudice and people's hate, people's biases into a biased AI. And there is no clear path out of it. No one knows how to avoid this problem. I mean, of course, I mean, you can try to add more diversity in your training sample, but still, you will never have a sample that actually does just to the people behind what it represents. Well, now we have had the first looks into the very problematic field of data being brought to daylight by artists such as Trevor Paglen and activists such as Kate Crawford. And we will look much more into that in the next lesson. For now, just an artist couple, Eva and Franco Mattes, that for a long time, like 25 years or so, have done a lot of work sometimes in a whimsical, sometimes in a very activist way, making visible all that comes with the technology that we use every day. And we will, as mentioned, look much more into that next time. But for now, this work, uncut by Eva and Franco Mattes, is kind of boiling down all that we have with our social media devices, our mobile devices, our accounts, our profiles. Because EFA and Franco, they paid $1,000 to a person to hand over their smartphone to them. So they approached people and said, would you just give us your smartphone with everything that's on it for $1,000? And they found people who would do that. And this is the work of art, is showing what's on the phone, all the personal things, everything that is totally tied to our most intimate lives is on our phones. These are the most intimate devices that we ever had. It is devices to whom we trust. We hand over everything that is close to us, that we carry with us day and night. They sit on our night desks and are always with us. Every communication that we have with our friends and with people who we fear runs on our mobile devices. And it is social media by which we connect. We become citizens of the world. We connect to people in close relationships in our communities and globally. So it is worthwhile taking next lesson to broaden our view and see what interactive media has created in terms of art, to make visible what interactive media is, what communication technology does with society and culture.